Taunton Bay, and now we're going to talk a little bit about the history of shipping and shipbuilding on Taunton Bay. And our speaker works as a volunteer in the photograph archive down at the Penobscot Maritime Museum, so he's almost every week touching something of historical interest. So I hope he'll touch on something that to do with Taunton Bay tonight. Thanks. Alan Brad.
I'll also add that as of 6 weeks ago, I'm the president of the Friends of Taunton Bay. Preps for this presentation started long before that happened. So the first question I get is always, what do you mean that we're shipping on Taunton Bay? What about the falls? Well, this cover picture is actually out here, loading granite paving blocks. All of these organizations have files that I delved in. I'm glad to see representatives from all three of the local historical societies here. Also, the Penobscot Marine Museum collections, two in particular. Harold Foss of Hancock, who was a salty dog and a deep water man way back, and Robert Appleby, who was actually in the Customs Service, held positions of increasing responsibility all through Maine. Eventually ended up in Washington, some sort of undersecretary, something. But he made a retirement project, and maybe pre-retirement project, of gathering up records from all the little custom houses around. And some of them had been transcribed but weren't centrally located, and he got a lot of that stuff pulled together. Between Foss and Appleby, every list of ships that I found for every town around here always comes back to, they have the most complete one, and the local historical society somehow made contact with them, and those are the lists in most part that they work on. Also, John Johansson, who actually spoke to the Franklin Historical Society a little while back. He publishes the Maine Coastal News. He's also down in Searsport every Friday as I am. We talk a fair amount. He is transcribing electronically a great deal of what particularly Appleby did, plus fishing things out of old newspapers. And he has got a massive database, which I had him pull materials for me, which was a huge leg up. And finally, our friends Mr. Google and the Internet. It is astounding what is out there. If you have the name of a ship, and maybe a town, as long as it's not called something like the America or Joe Smith. If you have something somewhat unique, there's astounding amounts of things that are out there. There's also newspaper databases, some of them you have to pay for. I subscribe to a couple. You go in and search those, and if you use Frenchman's Bay, all kinds of interesting things pop up. So here we are. I don't think I have to. Is that focused? Tell me when it's better. Well, okay. If I make this presentation elsewhere, I have to add a slide, but we all know where we are, right? So, upper end of Frenchman's Bay, Taunton Bay, in the box. Enough said. Another view, this is actually from a publication that was put together here in the past. Important comment, I don't care which side of the argument you're on. Is it Frenchman's Bay or Frenchman's Bay? I have seen official documents at all levels of government and towns. It's about 50-50. So, who knows? What is important here is the watershed, because the products that were shipped out of this bay were products of this watershed. They were mostly granite, forest products, other miscellaneous things. But the wood products are all on the downhill slopes facing here. The granite is mostly, and we'll touch on this more, from Sullivan and this part of Franklin, although it reaches up in here as well. a different view from an old nautical chart, which the soundings have not been updated forever. I can't see that it hasn't been updated since the 30s or so. The important thing is you see the deep water in the darkest blue. We often hear talk about Taunton Bay being a mudflat with a river running through it. There's your picture. Ships that could get up in the upper bay, for the most part very shallow draft. A lot of them had centerboards. You think of centerboards, you know, maybe on a little racing boat? Well, we had centerboards on some of these larger ships. They didn't put them up and down like you do every time you tack when you're racing, but that was how they dealt with it. The other thing was there were many very small little scows and what have you that were loaded in places you can't imagine that there was actually a little pier just up on the side, anywhere there was semblance of deepish water, a couple of feet of water. They would ground out at low tide, load them up, take them down the bay and transload the larger vessels. So here we are, stolen directly from the French and Bay Conservancy website. Aaron's going, yeah. Nice aerial shot of the first defining geographical characteristic here, getting past the falls. I assume everybody here has been there and knows what they look like. So just in case you hadn't, so this is a shot at high tide about a week ago, and the display is out front of French and Bay Conservancy's headquarters. And yes, we towed ships up past right through the falls. This is high tide. This is the tug Phillips Eaton. Yes, with one L in Philip. Very typical scene. This is the only photo I've actually found that shows a ship being towed right at the falls. They also sailed through. This tug didn't come along until the 1880s. So for 50, 60, 80 years before that, they were sailing through. The problem was you had to wait for tide and wind to be right, and they would bunch up for days, and then everybody would go at once. So now, semi-boring early history, but you have to have this for perspective. From the late 1600s on, this area was explored and fought over by English and French, being claims. In 1763, which coincides with the end of the French and Indian War, which actually is the last of 6 or 7 French and Indian Wars, the French were driven out from up here completely, and settlement started here in earnest. MDI, Frenchman's Bay, Sullivan, which at that time included Hancock, and Franklin were all had their first real influx of people about that time. Moses Butler, I think, was actually in Franklin a little before that. Not much, maybe 1761. I'm getting ahead of myself in the notes here. Yeah. Once here, all communication and travel was by water. No roads, barely even trails. But by 1775, there were thriving communities here. Trade, they were not self-sufficient by any means. Agriculture had not progressed, but they were surviving by trade with Portland and then Falmouth and Boston, Nova Scotia, and elsewhere. The Revolutionary War came on, and early on, there was a push of privateers out from here, captured a lot of vessels, raided Nova Scotia. After about 2 years of that, the tide turned, and this area was plundered, as the people here had plundered in Nova Scotia. The region was really strangling economically, and many families were sent back to Massachusetts. Maybe the men stayed, maybe they didn't. Although there were militia companies in both Sullivan and Hancock and Franklin that sent men to battles or engagements at Machias and down on MDI and down to Castine. Castine, of course, had been British stronghold. It had been a French stronghold, but now it was a British stronghold. There was a Penobscot expedition you've seen reference to lately. As the French frigate, the Hermione was just up here in Castine in July. Operating from that base, they had the British clamped down here. It was really tough, really hard. Post-Revolutionary War, the area repopulated. Sullivan incorporated in 1789 and included Hancock until 1828. Franklin, though, was plantation number 9. I'm looking at number 8. I'm sorry. Actually, was incorporated in 1825. Hancock County was organized in 1789, as was Washington County. Before that, it was part of counties much further south. An important thing, which I'm not going to go into any depth because it's 2 whole lectures by itself, but the history of land titles. People have been here for 30 years and been buying and selling land, but they didn't own it in the squatters. Other people had legal title. All of that was cleared up in 1803. Maine statehood happened in 1820. Transportation immediately following is still basically by water. There are nothing but really local roads, no through roads that even a wagon could use. There were well maybe not no, but there were hardly any horses. There were cattle, there were oxen, draft beasts, but there were no horses. They were useless. There were no roads to ride a horse on. There were foot trails in through the interior, and you'll see references in the history to following the spotted path of blazes on trees. It's like when you go out and take a nice hike on the French and Conservancy land, and there's a little path and there's colored blazes on trees. Well, that's what they were following. And people went back and forth to the Penobscot that way, if they didn't take a boat. The first railroads to Hancock and Franklin didn't happen until 1817 and 1818 from here. I believe it was 1817 from Franklin, and 1818 the first road came down here to what was the ferry. But the trade, always by water, sending out in the beginning mostly forest products, some other salt hay and a few agricultural products, fish, and received many other basics of life, manufactured items, clothing, and so on. Could not survive up here without that trade. And prosperity did slowly advance. Trade grew through Canada, even overseas, England, down to the West Indies, Europe. Many young men who grew up sailing in little coasters around here ended up as deep sea masters and were sailing to Europe and started a long tradition, well, all around in Maine, but Sullivan and Hancock are prime examples of communities that had many, many, many sons at sea. So early on for shipping and shipbuilding, from day one, there were boats and small vessels being built. A, there were no records. B, there was no registration of vessels. We know they had to have them because that was how they got around, but we don't know anything about them. So everybody had a vessel that was part of a group that did. Settlers came in clusters, and there was always the one guy who had the boat. Think of them as pickup trucks. Varying sizes. You're at 150, 250, or 350. But that was all-purpose. You could take care of them. You got around in them. That was your choice. The very first records of shipbuilding showed 1821 in Franklin, 1838 in Hancock. There's one vessel documented in Sullivan in 1798, then it really kicks in the 1820s. The records out extant today, mostly from the mid-1800s. Some are custom house records, some are from newspapers, but detail the vessels built with their measurements, where they were home ported, who the owners were. Ownership of any vessel of any kind of decent size, 50 feet or more, was practically always fractional. As they got bigger, it made much more sense for you to own a quarter of 4 vessels than 100% of one vessel. This is spreading your risk. Insurance 101. And people did that. So you would see a prosperous person might own shares in 8 or 10 ships. If you, in some bigger ones, if you actually owned maybe a 16, you probably had the naming rights. You were could be the controlling owner. You might even be the master. A lot of the information on vessels arriving and departing show up in newspapers, in shipping news or shipping intelligence columns. If you go down online databases, they'll actually say, do you want to look at the shipping news? And I said, yes, I want to. Frenchman's Bay Customs District was established in 1789. They went through umpteen mutations, as they all did. There was a second customs district in Hancock County that covered Blue Hill and the east shore of Penobscot Bay. But Frenchman's Bay District was Frenchman's Bay, Taunton Bay, the Union River, waters around MBI. There were, at times, up to 5 custom houses in the district. Eventually, the headquarters migrated to Ellsworth. Again, there were satellite offices. There was one here in Sullivan that ended up at Mount Desert Ferry when the railroad came in. There was one in Bar Harbor. There was one in Southwest Harbor. And so that these are important because once you had a vessel of any size, they did have to be registered. There were extensive regulations. Vessel had to clear with customs, even to declare, I'm just going down the coast with stuff made here and being sold here, and I don't owe any duties, but you still had to positively declare that you didn't owe any customs. So we're coming to the end of the history. Slides here. Starting in 1800, early 1800s, there were 2 huge economic shocks set the area way back again. Jefferson's Embargo Act of 1807, also known as the Non-Intercourse Act, shut down trade completely. This killed New England, not just here. It's like any place else, when you shut down a major business, all of a sudden money's not flowing in the local economy and times are tough. It lasted 15 months and it was a disaster. Then along came the War of 1812, and the British basically raided at will through here, down around up to Penobscot, operated out of Castine again. The battles and destruction of Hamden and up into Bangalore. So, as coming out of that, then by 1820, Maine had had it with Massachusetts. They've been rumblings ever since the Revolution, when Maine was the poor stepchild. Part of the Missouri Compromise, when Missouri was admitted as a slave state, Maine was a free state. Trade picked up. It was a major occupation for a lot of people. The early shipyards around here, all you needed was a moderately open piece of land with a moderately decent slope towards the water and some sort of deep water just offshore, just so that on the highest of high tides you could get the thing afloat and then take it someplace else and ballast it down and finish it out. The spots on the shore where ships were built, you just can't believe. But they did, and it was just in the open. There were no buildings, there were no machinery. They worked on them in the winter and in the snow. Vessels were small. They were For the most part, small sloops and scows, one mast. Scow implies a really flat bottom. Two masters, mostly schooners, which would have fore and aft sails, or brigs, which were very popular at this time. The brig would have square sails on the forward mast and the fore and aft sail on the after mast. Some of these 80-foot brigs regularly went back and forth to England. If someone told you they were going to do that today, you'd look at them like they were crazy. They did it as a matter of course. They tended to be used interchangeably. Some of them they would be built for fishing, might be used in trade. A typical scenario is they went to the banks, caught the fish, brought them back, dried them. Then there was a winter trip to the West Indies to sell the fish. Repeat the cycle. Now most of that's below the falls. Not a lot going on up here. There was actually a bridge from Hancock to Sullivan, built in the 1820s, and the ice finally took it out, and the worms, after about 15 years or so. But the area was producing many shipmasters. Typically, they would go to sea as a young man, probably on a family vessel, 1 or 2 trips before the mast. Move up to mate by age 20. In another couple of years, would graduate to be a master, often as a part owner, retire ashore at 40. The wife would say, "You've already beat the odds, stay home with us kids." And they would literally buy a farm, or many then became merchants and ship owners. And many variations on the theme, mix and match, one size does not fit all. But that was a typical career path, if you will. So from the 1840s on, last one of these, we started to see production yards. Serious shipyards were set up. Now, the vast majority of the shipbuilding on Taunton Bay was all the way up the Bay of Franklin. There are only 5 ships built in Hancock of 30-odd that we can prove were built on the bay above the falls. As far as I can tell, none in Sullivan. It was all down at Sullivan Harbor and East Sullivan. Feel free to correct me, Gary, if I'm wrong. But 57 vessels, including some pretty good size, were built out of there. So the vessels are getting bigger. Trade on the bay ramps up. The first granite quarries opened in Sullivan and Franklin in the 1840s. Product was by and large paving stones and curbing. There was some ornamental and big block work. There were examples of it being used in a couple of famous buildings. But by and large, day-to-day, it was paving blocks. This business was subject to all kinds of waxing and waning. It had its peaks and valleys to about 1910. It probably constituted 80% of what was shipped out of the bay down over the falls and off to the cities. Other things, lumber products. There were lots of mills, especially out in Franklin, and they made turned out lumber, they turned out lath, they turned out shingles, knockdown barrels, knockdown boxes, cord with the barrels in the boxes and ship them in bundles, and they'd go like down to the West Indies, and then they'd have sugar in the boxes, or molasses in the barrels, or whatever. There was still really no practical overland overland transport. There was mining in the 1880s. This shore was lined with silver mines. The only people who made any money, as is usual in a scenario like this, were the people who were selling the mining equipment to the people operating the mine. No mine ever made money. And merchants were shipping local product and bringing supplies back for their businesses and for day-to-day life. Typical for a merchant to send out a cargo in September or October, have it come back with all kinds of goods, and that would stock his general store till the next spring. So this is stolen from the Sullivan Sorrento story. Nice little map, but this gives you an idea of all the quarries. In Sullivan, you see them bleeding over into Franklin. Now, what it doesn't show is there are also quarries above Taunton Bay. But the second defining geographic characteristic to this region economically, the Sullivan Pluton. This part of Sullivan and Franklin is one gigantic granite outcrop. And the quarrying that went on was basically reducing outcrops and mounds. It was, if you've been elsewhere, when you talk about quarries, it was really deep holes in the ground. It's not the way it worked around here at all. They could get 20 or 30 feet deep. They drained them mostly with siphons. They didn't need pumps. By the way, the Hancock side of the river, completely different. You know, it's gravel. Underneath the gravel, the bedrock is so-called Ellsworth schist. It's a black, volcanic, useless, expensive to blast. This is taken from a U.S. Geological Survey report found it on the web. It's a massive PDF from 1907, but these are two shots of one of the larger quarries, Crabtree's and Havens, here in Sullivan. And you see what they've done is reduced a hill. And it's not overly technologically complex. There's a couple of booms, but not. By this time, there were probably a couple of little steam engines around being used to power some equipment, but very simple. Humidity as everybody's sticking together. So once you get the granite out of the ground, you head to shipping. So this is a fairly early view of Gordon's Wharf, right out here. You notice there's no granite block around it yet. Those are stacks of paving stones, and they've got these little derricks, and they're hoisting. You can see it. Platform that's just loaded with them. But they got that bucket got loaded by hand and unloaded by hand, and the blocks got stowed by hand. Miserable work. This is 10 or 15 years later. I'm approximating this date of 1880 because you can't see on the opposite shore of the Waukee Railroad Station. There are pictures of it. It has a very distinct gambrel roof. I don't know exactly when that building was built, but this is 1880, maybe as far as 1890. But again, they're loading paving blocks. Now you all know this is track road, or it's track road up the other way. There was briefly early on some sort of a horse-drawn rail system. By the time photography came along, they're just using carts. There's no more rail system. But this is one of my favorite pictures. And it's actually reproduced. There are copies of a number of these pictures over on the table. You'll see them later. That one's actually going to stay here. This is from a glass plate negative that Sullivan Sorrento Historical Society does. And you have the crew that was doing the loading was all lined up along the rail between the after two masts. And this is post, obviously. The cartmen are, are parked and looking at the camera. There's some small miscellaneous larger pieces of granite there, but the big stacks of paving stones that will get loaded. On the last picture, just for a second. That's the ferry landing for
That's the ferry land.
the boats that came back and forth. And every kind of vessel you can think of was used. You know, every kind of locomotion that you can imagine was used over the years. This is North Sullivan, this shore further up. If you've ever kayaked or boated up the river here, it's a deep channel on this side, and the shoreline looks kind of regular in places. Those are the remains of these quay walls that were lined, literally, with schooners loading from those quarries. They all just had little cart roads that came down, you know, a mile to go, half a mile from the woods. And they loaded. These are mostly two-masted schooners. There were some threes that would get up in there. This view is actually taken from across the river at Lincoln Wharf, which we're going to get to in a second. The mud flats on this side. This is what one of those little loading quays looked like. I don't know exactly which one it is. There's no documentation with it. But effectively, they built a little bit of a wall, drove a few pilings, had this platform that's what, maybe 20 feet wide. There's a landing on the ground, on the earth, for these carts full of stone to come down, and back them up, and load them in by hand. It didn't take much. And that's actually a three-masted schooner. That's good size. But that's typical day-to-day. That's what it looked like, folks. Now, this photo, I'm missing the credit, is way down the bottom. This was in the files at the Hancock Historical Society. This is the outer end of Lincoln Wharf, and where that shot we just looked at was taken. The value in this is how piers were constructed, or wharves were constructed on the mud flats. It's a big, long, log, open curb work that was then just dumped full of rubble stone. Decked over, reached out 100, 150 feet. The schooners berthed at the end of it, bottomed out in the mud. That was the way they did it. You just can't see. There are some other vessels there. Don't hurt your eyes.
Where's Lincoln Wharf in Hancock?
I will show you that. In fact, let me jump ahead. This is Lincoln Wharf here. It's at the end of Cemetery Road. If you're down past the school, I'm familiar with that because that's where I live. Lincoln Wharf was built by my great-great-grandfather. So I'm familiar with that view across these. This is where those ships were all lined up. Gordon's Wharf is back down here. No. This and the next one are taken from tin types that are in the files of the Hancock Historical Society. This is the inner end of that wharf. This was a ship's chandlery. You'll notice there's a gentleman sitting in the wagon, and then there's another gentleman standing in front of the door here, holding this curved piece of wood. And my informed speculation is the gentleman sitting in the surrey, or the wagon there, is my great-great-grandfather, because the owner would be the guy who sat on his wagon and had his picture taken. And the gentleman holding the curved piece of wood, which I believe is a pattern for ribs for a ship, is probably Steve Perrin's great-grandfather. This man's name is Thomas Merchant. He was the master builder for Lemuel Crabtree and a number of ships that were built at this site. The next one. He's backed off from there. Now the dignitaries have left and the photographer is reset. But this pile of stuff in the foreground looks to me like timbers that have been roughed out to start making ribs for a ship. And so the master builder, Thomas Merchant, Master Shipwright. This was a formal title. Master builders were the predecessors of naval architects. They knew the ancient and arcane art of properly building vessels. There were lots of regulations even back then about how you could and couldn't do it. Just as important, the name of the master builder went on registration certificates, and if you wanted insurance on a vessel, you better have had a master builder who had a good reputation, or you weren't going to get any insurance. Sailing without insurance was really dumb. It was done, but in the case of ultra-frequent shipwrecks, you could be wiped out. Now this building was actually moved up to the center of Hancock about 1880. There are some pictures over on the table. This was factory store up in Hancock Corner. Went through 6 or 7 iterations, ended up with Marston's IGA. Then the bait shop owned it. It burned in 1883, and the current bait shop is right on that site. That's where that building had before the auction, and they hauled it up there. The pier stayed around for a while, but its remnants can still be seen. Some of that crib work is still there in the rock infill.
The building burned in 1983.
I'm sorry?
The building burned in 1983.
Did I say 18? Yeah, no, they moved it in 1883. They burned it. Yes, thank you.
Where did the grand piano come from that's down there?
Good question. There's a, up against the crib work, buried in the bushes, is the metal frame from a grand piano, baby green, I think. Everyone who walks the shore down there asks that same question. Nobody has the answer. But if you want to see a rusty hunk of a grand piano. So coming back to this, we've been working our way up the river where much of the deep water things went on. Make sure I said everything I meant to say. Yeah. So now we can look up at Franklin. And I've only highlighted 2 places, which are Shipyard Point and Springer's Creek, where we know large numbers of vessels were built. But down here at Butler Point and lots of other spots along here, vessels were set up. Some of them pretty small, and they didn't take a whole lot of water to get them to float at a good high tide. Most of the vessels that were built in the bay were 2-masted schooners, 80, 90 feet. Drew 6, 7, 8 feet. Way at the end of things, there were some bigger ones launched at Shipyard Point. And this is one of them. Wow. This is the John Paul Gordon Shipyard in Franklin at Shipyard Point, 1890. Schooner Carolyn Foss, we have a descendant in the room. They needed a really, really high tide. So this is probably 3 hours or 2 hours before the launch happened. There are still men running around doing things, but the crowd is gathering. This launch went off without a hitch. She was fairly quickly towed down the bay, first to Lincoln Wharf and then later to Simpson's Wharf, down in Sullivan Harbor for final outfitting. In frame behind her, this over here is a vessel launched a year later called the John Paul, which was also a Foss family. That's not even more so a Foss family vessel. Orlando Foss was the majority owner, was her first captain. Each of his 3 seagoing sons were her captain at one point in time. One of those sons is Harold Foss, who known as line number 2. There are, in some of Foss's writings, he talks about as a little kid, he was all over these 2 houses. His dad couldn't keep him home. He was fascinated. when the John Paul was launched, it took them 3 tries. They got stuck in the mud twice. It was less than glorious. Yes, so the Carolyn Foss, according to some newspaper articles that Emory Beck, frankly, has kindly supplied and taken from the Ellsworth American. Within a couple of weeks, she was loading a cargo of granite on her way.
What size was Carolyn Foss?
Here it is. It's in the briefcase. It was approaching 300 tons. That's 130, 140 feet, something like that. I can give you great detail if you like. It's in my briefcase. So at this point, I've told you a little bit about Harold Foss. I'll tell you a little more. After growing up here, going to sea on vessels like this, he was at sea for 55 years, something like that. Feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but was a naval officer commanding auxiliaries during World War I. During World War II, he captained steamships in the Merchant Marine. In between, he and a fellow named Fred Crabtree, also from Hancock and later at Millbridge, owned what was the last large shipping firm easily in New England, maybe on the East Coast, that had a fleet of ocean-going schooners. And Harold Foss invented a whole new trade. He specialized, he invented, discovered, and exploited goatina. You've heard of guano? Well, this is the goat equivalent. There was an island down off Venezuela that was piled higher than you can imagine with this stuff. He brought samples of it to fertilizer companies all up and down the East Coast and created a market, owned 4 or 5 vessels that just went back and forth down there. He was also a larger-than-life person who was involved in all the big marine societies in Boston. Retired back here, had quite an extensive set of papers that were all donated after his death to the Marine Museum in Searsport. And I've crawled back and through that, actually cataloged some of that. It was quite interesting. The shipyard. Oh, and for full disclosure, Harold Foss was married to my grandmother's sister. His first wife. I never knew the man. He was my great uncle. I'd never heard of him until long after he was gone. John Paul Gordon of Franklin was another larger-than-life character. I believe the Gordons originated here, but he was a Franklin person. He went to sea as a young man. He was a shipmaster. There are stories around that he wasn't a 49er, but he went to California and he came back with money in his pocket. He ended up owning shipyards and quarries and woodland and mills, manufacturing various wood products, stores. He had swingers and everything. He was a very, very big fish in the small town of Franklin. And beat a guy to death in the road one day in some kind of dispute and beat the manslaughter charge. It's a newspaper story.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
It looks like there were 3 stays onto that bowsprit, so it had 3 jibs. The 2 guys are at the end of 2 of them, and the one farther back. Is that a typical design?
Yeah, that's fairly typical. I think this is being launched fully rigged. I haven't seen it blown up quite this big before. Yeah, there's all kinds of extra. There are 3 stages, yeah, so that's about right. And so it would have had the 3 big mainsails, and then there would be topsails above that. And some of these ships would then fly small staysails, so-called, between the masts, but I don't believe that went on here. But this is a classic Maine three-masted schooner. I have cataloged umpteen pictures of them, and this is what they look like. Do you have a question, Bruce?
Yes, is the Gordon's Wharf named after the same family?
Gary?
Probably Gordon's Wharf got its name in its current name in the 70s when Helen and Tomcat owned this property.
Yeah.
And before that it was named, I don't know what it was named.
Yeah, the structure clearly has been here. Every map you look at, it's labeled differently. I have not studied deeds and Sullivan to follow all that, and I guess maybe you haven't either. But so Gordon and the Foss family were two very interesting groups of people. It's good that I just called on Gary. I asked him to tell you a little bit. This is Gary Evans of the Sullivan Historical Society. There was another sea story from up here that's interesting. There was a captain from Trenton who married a young woman from Sullivan and built a ship, I believe up in Franklin, it was Blaze Hill. And they sailed the world together for a long time. Here, you can fill in the blanks.
Sort of. I need some light. Actually, my wife Jeannie, who used to be the president of this society, did this research. And we found out about it one day when we got an email on our website that said, do you know anything about the Manny Swan? So we started researching the Manny Swan. Manny Swan was captained by a fellow named Hollis Higgins from Trenton. I'm just going to paraphrase this down a little bit instead of reading it, because I got another story that I want to tell while I got the floor. Hollis was born in Trenton in 1830, and he married Arabella Bell Worcester from Sullivan. Her family home was just the other side of where Sumner High School is now, going down that little dip. But there were a bunch of Worcesters here in North Sullivan, West Sullivan, and there's a small Worcester cemetery in the woods right up on the Franklin-Sullivan line that we discovered some time back. But Bell and Hollis basically lived at sea for many, many, many years. And after the Manny Swan, they owned part of some 2 or 3 different vessels. But I think the last vessel that they ran and lived on was the Bell Worcester, which was built at Shipyard Point in Franklin. Do you have a picture of that?
No, I don't.
Well, we do at the museum that we got from the Penobscot Museum. It's a beautiful ship, and the painting has one of those triangle-shaped banners, or what do they call them?
There's a formal ship portrait. There's always a banner from one of the masts.
And it says Bell Worcester.
Yeah.
But I guess they were a pretty famous couple up and down in the shipping world, up and down the East Coast, because they lived on the ship, they had their animals on the ship, they often, I guess Belle had pets of fairly exotic animals that she kept. And when Hollis died, she moved back and lived with her sister in the family farm house until she died. Hollis died in 1916, I think, and Belle died 1924. See, she's got to remember. Just kind of an interesting story. Started out with, you know anything about a boat called the Manny Swan? Hollis and Bell are buried in the North Ellsworth Cemetery with his parents in a family plot. We stopped one day, found it, and took some photos. So it's just kind of a neat little thing. But you talked about the track road, and Well, some of what I'm gonna say is in fact, is not proven fact, but my understanding is that when the railroad track, there was a double track set just to the side of the road. And they didn't use horses, they used gravity. There was a big bull wheel on the top, this is how I understand it. Big bull wheel on the top, so they would load a cart on the top, had the empty cart on the bottom, the weight would, they'd let it run down. And then they'd repeat it. Now I'm gonna defer to John in the back. One of the Gordons, Gary, who's on our board of directors of the Historical Society, was one of the Gordons that grew up here in Northwest Sullivan. If anybody can actually tell me where north starts and west starts, it'll be interesting. But his grandfather, I believe, remember seeing one of those carts that got away and flopped off the end of the wharf. John Daly in the back has basically found it. And he and I have talked, and we'd like to see if we can get it up. Whether or not that'll ever happen is not, but somewhere off the bridge side, right about the corner, right, John?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah. What happened?
I believe it was a gravity feed, and the rails were made of wood.
Yeah.
And the braking system failed, and she launched herself with a stone into the bay. And actually, about 6 years ago, I had some traps caught there. So we went down to dive, and my boy that was with me, my boy, I thought he was, Eric Kilpatrick came up and he said, "You have to believe what you're attached to." I said, "What is it?" Because I don't know. But he's got iron wheels like this, he said, and it's kind of big and iron and heavy. And I said, "Okay, do an arm span, try to figure out how big it is." So I sent him back down, and he comes up, he said, "I don't know." Well, we were so wrapped up, we just took a knife and started cutting the rope, which couldn't get it out of there. So Gary Gordon was talking to him, and he said, "I can tell you exactly what it is." He said, because Gamp Davis up here was a little boy, and he said he was standing there, but he shot by everybody instead of landing in the bag. And I told him where it was. He said, "That's exactly where that end of that rail would have been." And I said, "Well," I said, "I don't believe there's any stone left on it. It's on its side." And my wife and I, the scuba instructors at the university, so we have about 16 students coming out. When I get them certified, we're going to use them. So we put them to work, basically, what we're going to do. And I spoke to Rusty Gordon about it, and Mark Andrews has volunteered to use his wrecker. And
cool.
So I kind of left it at that. Right now, we'll see what we find.
Living history.
Thank you very much, both of you. Continuing back in Franklin, this is Shipyard Point. It's an aerial picture taken Monday when Friends of Taunton Bay's annual overflight of the bay went on. You see here, I hope pretty clearly, there are 4 sets of remains of piers, and this would have been that standard crib work filled with rubble stone. They're well silted in here now. This down here, by the way, is Mike Briggs' oyster rafts. Taunton Bay oyster company. Some of them. Frank tells me the depth of water out here can still be 8-9 feet. Right?
It's dead low.
Yeah. Which is enough at high tide to actually float something, at least briefly. We also shouldn't consider for a second that the water depths today are what they were 100 years ago or 150 years ago. The shore was deforested. Water flow from the streams was undoubtedly heavier at times. There's been siltation, over time. No body of water stays the same. So that sites that were utilized then, you wouldn't recognize today. Others, you still can. I'm told that also in Springers Creek, which is just off the screen to the left, There are also remnants.
Stone there just to the right of the box, that other little point, is that?
That?
No, further down, right there.
Yeah. Could be.
There's some big rocks out there that are covered at high tide and are washing a little time.
And it could be. One of the other things that went on with when piers like this or the little quays or whatever, any little landing was made, well, after they built their little pier, then people went out there and hauled all the rocks out of there. So when you bottomed out your boat, you weren't puncturing the hull. And I don't know for a fact that it happened here, but in many places, the sawdust from the mills was dumped off the ends of those piers to make the mud even softer for when the ships would bottom out at low tide. It's reasonable to expect that happened. So as a summation of Franklin Shipbuilding, over the years there were about 10 plus or minus. Most of the locations are kind of hazy. We know they were all along the Franklin shore. The peak building period was actually 1850 to 1875, a sheer number of vessels, though they were smaller. J.P. Gordon actually restarted the industry and built these 4 ships between 1882 and 1896. They were built. He had pieces of them. There were a couple of the Foss family. There were a couple. There was a summer visitor to Hancock Point. His last name was Maxwell. And then there's a rich guy from Saugerties, New York, which was halfway up the Hudson.
Maxwell named either 3 or 4 of his vessels for his sons.
Right. There's the Willie, and I'm not remembering them all off the top of my head. And he had some built in Millbridge in one year. He liked down east built vessels. And so the last one was built in 1896, and the newspaper stories say, and then J.P. Gordon shut down and dismantled his yard. That was it. It was over. Much of the building materials were timber from the woods out beyond the bay. They used various hardwoods, hack for the knees. These are the braces under the decks. Some was imported, southern yellow or hard pine, some white oak. There's no white oak out here, so they had to have brought it in. It seems that Franklin at one time supported just about every trade that is needed to put together a vessel. I didn't see rope makers, but other than that, there was a lot of itinerant labor that came into town for big projects. When Gordon built those last couple of vessels, he put up a bunkhouse. There was also a fairly large repair business in some of these yards. I believe there was at least one marine railway that would haul out. There were winter haul-outs. There was considerable building of small, non-registered craft, these little scows and boats and so on. There were steam launches, small steam launches, way smaller than even the 50-foot tugboat that were in use in the Upper Bay. It would appear that they were imported. I've not seen any evidence that there were any boilermakers or tradesmen in Franklin who could do that kind of marine engineering. You should note that if you've ever been down to Maine Maritime in Bath, and there's the Percy and Small shipyard, and the big schooner, and they've got the gigantic woodworking shop with these huge woodworking machines. That didn't happen here. This was all handwork, practically all handwork. Maybe right at the end, Gordon had some, but before that, they were working in the open. They were using hand tools and simple derricks. This popped up one day when I was Googling. And Emery gave me the key to it. I'm looking at this article in the New York Times in 1901 that starts talking about they're going to build this gigantic schooner in Franklin. For background, a 7-masted schooner. There was only one that was ever built. It was built a year later. It's called Thomas W. Lawson. He built it for River down in Quincy. The last master who wrecked her over in the English Channel was a gentleman named George Dow from Hancock. Other than that, there's no connection. The dimensions of this vessel, notice it was going to draw 18 feet of water. No place off Franklin can you float a vessel that would draw 18 feet of water. This thing is a monster. I doubt that you could have got it through the falls, really. So I started to read it, and because I've been researching this stuff for years, I just started to laugh. But Sawyer Brothers of Millbridge down here were a top-of-the-line, very well-known firm up in Millbridge, cranked out a lot of vessels. And the owners were going to be John Paul Gordon, Crabtree and Havey, quarry firm, Dunbar Brothers, also a quarry firm, and Captain Orlando Frost. Somebody knew the area really well. And we're going to cost $55,000. It works out to about $8 million. Fortunately, Emery found in the Ellsworth American a couple of items snidely referring to the Tunk Lake fish story that has been perpetrated on the world. You got to have a little humor. So, this is a classic photo. Unfortunately, we don't know where it is other than it emerged from the files of the Hancock Historical Society. But this is a two-masted scow schooner with no topsails, one jib, very simple, a two-man crew, one aft, one forward, towing a dory, and loaded with wood products. I think it's bundles of shingles back on the stern. I can't tell what between the two masts. But if you look down on the bay, and then back in the mid to late 1800s, this was the kind of thing you saw. So we do need to talk about the business of shipping a little bit. It took many forms here, and there are umpteen variants, but for the most part, the quarry owners and mill owners, many of them shipped in their own vessels, some of which were built here, some of which were built elsewhere. They bought them new. They picked up a couple used. When a quarry owner got a big contract, he might buy two little schooners and spend a year, year and a half hauling paving stones to Boston and Philadelphia and New York, and then sell it off again. There were shipping agents. One here in Sullivan was Havey and Havey, I'll get to in a second. But they handle things like chartering vessels, matching vessels with loads, consolidating odd lots into a load. They actually handled the stevedore, the loading and unloading. They arranged for the tug. They handled the billing. Some or all or none, each situation was different. Sullivan Serrano Historical Society has some journals from the 1890s and 1880s from Havey and Havey in a building right up the road here. And scanning through it, I'd like to go back and transcribe it. Who has that kind of time? Showed them, just them, this one firm, handling the loading of 30 to 40 ships each year during a roughly 8-month shipping season. They had log pages for, the ship, the consignor, the consignee, the freight charges, so on. They also, in the back of some of these, there were logs of granite loaned and granite borrowed. These guys would trade odd lots. Somebody had a contract, somebody else had stone, a deal was made, they would settle up periodically. You could go into the store, if you were a small landowner and you had a granite outcrop in your backyard, you could go out there and cut paving stone and go in the store. It's just like bringing chicken and eggs into the store. to trade for flour. Well, you can bring paving blocks to the store. It took a lot of them, but they did it. There was just the barter economy was still in full force back then. And one of the interesting things is that towage fees for the tug, $25 to come up over the falls, and $2 more if they actually docked it. This is a bill of lading, which came out of files in Hancock. Again, it hits on my family. This is Crabtree and Havey shipping on the good schooner A.B. Crabtree, who was the Crabtree and Havey, captained by, I think it's P.H. Stratton. Can't find him in Hancock. There's a bazillion Strattons in Hancock. I didn't find him. For this voyage, now lying in the port of Hancock, bound for Boston, 2,120 cubic feet, more or less, of granite. And it's consigned to, you can't read it there, but I found it in the Boston Directory, Gilman and Cheney in Boston. So 2,120 cubic feet of granite at a freight rate of 10 cents a foot. The freight bill was $212. Now out of that came, they didn't make a whole lot of money off of this. Of course they made a lot of trips, but by the time you paid your crew and paid your dockage fees and so on and so forth, there's not a lot left. There are other ones where they got a slightly higher freight rate.
Can you read the signature on the Stratton?
I think it's P.H.
There was Herbert Stratton, who was an architect who built stores and all sorts of.
Okay, yeah. I'll talk to you at length about this.
I don't know what language.
Oh, okay.
This is an odd name.
I went into the census records for Hancock and found bazillions of Strattons, but not him. But Ellsworth,
Yeah, he lived in Ellsworth.
I'll look. And this was 1875, by the way. Handwriting's a little hard to read here. So, coming back to the tug. This is the tug Phillips Eaton of the Sullivan Falls Towboat Company, which was organized in 1883. One of the benefits of things happening after about 1880 is there are actually photographs. One of the things very interesting about this picture, she's docked somewhere out here. Gary, don't answer. Does anybody else know what that building in the background is? On the left? That's the head house of the elevator, top of the elevators for a mine shaft. That's one of the soda mines.
I'm not sure.
No?
That may be the KP hall up over the hill.
Yeah, but this right here.
Oh, that.
That.
Okay. The house, okay.
Yeah, yeah, the house is still there. The mine buildings are all gone.
Right.
But,
The building off to the right
yeah.
is the boarding house that many of the mine employees lived at.
Yeah.
And that building was there until into the late 50s, 60s, before it finally fell down.
Yeah. So where exactly on this shore was that then?
Just up
Right
there. Right over there.
There. If you find, I have seen a mining map, but I didn't locate it to put it in here. There were mines dotted all along here, 15 or 20 of them along here in a mile or two. There were also a couple over the Hancock side and some up in Egypt Bay. And like I said, the only people who made money were the ones who sold supplies. So here she is towing on the river. The other somewhat interesting thing about the Sullivan Falls Towboat Company, guess who owned it? John Paul Gordon, a bunch of the Sullivan Quarry owners, a couple of people from Sullivan, from Franklin, and a couple of people from Hancock. They paid in $50 or $100. They raised $5,000, bought that tug, gave themselves free towage, You see it waved in some of the logs, but everybody else paid cash. This is another, just a classic scene. Small two-masted schooner, empty, headed up the river, with the tug in the foreground. This is the kind of scene that didn't get photographed much because it's not a special event. There's nothing fancy going on. Just ordinary. This is more notable. This is from Sullivan Serrano. This is a four-masted schooner coming up, had come past the bay, and it's actually right up here. That ice is out about where the bridge was, I should say. And here she is docking here at what is now Gordon's Wharf.
Big ship.
Yeah, that. I was stunned when I saw this. I didn't think you'd get a ship this big up here. Right here is the stack of the tug. So the tug is outboard on the port side. Berther. And it's winter, snow covered. It's an extreme high tide. You see how high the water is, right on the top of the wharf. So we had shipping and shipbuilding. The end of it all came very quickly. The granite business had been cyclical. There was a strike here in 1903 that was eventually settled. There was a upturn. And then all of a sudden, granite paving blocks were obsolete, and the business just disappeared. Shipbuilding up here had already ended. More and more coast-wise freight was moving in steamers, on schooners. There was still strong shipbuilding elsewhere in Maine, bigger ports like Thomasville, Rockland, Camden, Belfast, Waldburg, and further down east, and so on, but not here. The small ships that were built here were just too small at that point. During World War I, there was a big, short ramp up in wooden shipbuilding again, and large schooners were built for a couple of years. Doesn't appear to have had any impact up here, other than probably people left here to go work in those yards. And then came the railroads. So the Mount Desert Ferry line, well, that didn't bring just rich tourists in the summer. That was year-round service, and a lot of freight came up here and left here. So it was one of the things about shipping in small schooners was you could make a return card, get a return card. Well, those disappeared pretty much too. It was coming in by train. There were exceptions. There were coal came in some of the small schooners. You would get to various places. To Mount Desert Ferry, a lot of coal was imported through that terminal when the tourists weren't looking. Meanwhile, up in Franklin, the Main Shore Railroad, which quickly became the Cal's branch of the Main Central, arrived right at the turn of the century. Also, there's no earthly reason to double handle freight in Franklin to send it on a slow boat down the bay. You put it on a train. And so that really put the nail in the coffin. Things were pretty dead anyway. Once the railroads were in, there was just no earthly reason to be shipping on the bay. They were very, very little. And it was over. Except for the predecessor of this bridge, well known as the Singing Bridge, which was actually built, which only started to sing in the 50s. It was originally built in 1926, I believe it is. This picture has to be right before that. In fact, the lower left in the foreground may even be abutment work for the new bridge. But this was the last iteration of the Waukee Ferry, from just over there to just over here. There's a power boat lashed alongside this little scow and 3 early 20s vintage cars. I'm not an automobile expert, but they don't like me. And that was the kind of the last commercial shipping here. And that's it. It was a fascinating period, and there are now children of people who remembered it, but nobody around who actually participated anymore, I don't think. Question?
I understood another cargo that they used to ship a lot out of Franklin was ice.
Okay, yeah, I had not encountered that, but certainly ice was a major product all up and down the Maine coast. Entirely likely.